Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Governance, Corruption, and Justice. I'm your hostess this evening, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and this evening we will be getting into a very interesting or heated sort of topic, and that has to do with flaring. ExxonMobil would have had a press conference recently, and a number of issues were addressed, many of them rooted in comments that would have been reported by the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. Vincent Adams. And we have Dr. Adams with us tonight, joining us virtually to answer some of the questions that we have with regard to that press conference and to respond to some of the statements that were made by ExxonMobil's head, Mr. Alistair Routledge. He's the head for the Guyana headquarters. So, Dr. Adams, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Definitely, Kiana. I'm becoming your regular guest here, it seems.
Yes, it has. And we do, we're very grateful for the knowledge that you have continued to share with us here at Kaieteur News. So without further ado, let me get straight into tonight's discussion. Now, Dr. Adams, one of the interesting details that came out at the press conference ExxonMobil had was that there's basically no violation of the permit that they have for the Liza Phase 1 project, and no law is being violated with the flaring that is taking place offshore. In fact, what ExxonMobil has said is that the flaring that is going on is catered for under the permit, which allows for the provision of maintenance and repairs. What say you to this sort of comment?
Yeah, Kiana, by the way, I thought that you were going to show up late because you're celebrating your boss's birthday.
Yes.
Glenn, Glenn, tell him I say happy birthday.
I will. He's enjoying the festivities at the moment.
Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't lose the opportunity. But anyway, Kiana, I think that, all Guyanese should be disgusted, by this continued misinformation, untruthfulness, insult, and condescension exacted upon us by Exxon. But most distressing is when these things are being repeated by our own government. And it's because of persistence and the vigilance of the press, such as yourself, that they are getting caught up in this web of misinformation, which is really sad and embarrassing, to say the least. To get to, your exact question, I'm just getting sick and tired of them just outright lying. They know better than that. I think one of the things that galls me, and I'm sure should gall every single Guyanese, is that I think Exxon believes that we are all fools. We can't read, for example. We may not have, the petroleum background and pedigree that Exxon may possess, but I wish to inform them that all of us who have it, we ain't going any place, and the rest of us who doesn't have it, we have common sense and we can read. And it's very, very clear that if you read the permit, there's no way, just how they get caught up in the lies with this 14 billion cubic feet that they were claiming all along, and say, basically, coming after me saying that, remember, they would get caught up in that lie that somehow the 14 billion cubic feet cap for flaring existed. And eventually, this just couldn't stand the pressure, because when people like yourself started putting pressure on them to show where it's at, they couldn't do it. They couldn't show what was the impossible, which is to show what doesn't exist. So now here's another lie that we've been faced with, and this here has been going on since they started production, as you know, because I know you've been after this whole flaring thing from day one. So let me tell you, the permit is very clear. And every single Guyanese should go there and read the permit, or you can even put it in the newspapers. Put the clause in there. It's very clear, and you don't have to be a petroleum expert to read what it says. Here's what it says. Short. It says under section 3.6, routine flaring is prohibited unless or except for startup, emergencies, process upsets, or maintenance. So when they started this thing, when I was at the EPA, when they started flaring, they came up with this gimmick that they were still in startup. Months after, they were producing and selling millions of barrels on the market, and they still wanted to use this startup gimmick. Of course, we shot that down. Not only was it shut down, they were forced to cut back on production, which meant that they recognized that they were, and they cut back to a rate when we said, well, okay, they're fixing this stuff. We're going to give them, we're going to give them a little time. Sorry,
Dr. Adams, just one moment, because I think that your audio is, there's some technical difficulties going on there. If you could just adjust your microphone, perhaps.
Yeah, you got it now?
Yes, you're very clear now. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things so let me just to recap a little bit so that it could be coherent here. I mentioned that section 3.6 that say that thou shalt not flare, basically. Flaring is prohibited under startup, maintenance, and emergencies. So initially when this thing all started, they started using, we were in startup. Well, no, anybody with a little bit of gray matter between their ears would not say that you were in startup mode months after you started producing and selling millions of barrels in the market. Anyway, I think they got forced, they accepted that, they cut back on production. We worked with them, they cut back on production at the level to maintain stability in the reservoir, etc., until they fix it. Okay, so that went away. This time around now, they know that dog doesn't bark anymore. They can't come back with that nonsense. So guess what they're saying now? They go to another condition, which is maintenance. Well, by the way, this is even worse, because now they're operating at the maximum production rate that is allowed, the safe maximum production rate that is allowed by the environmental impact assessment. It says that this here is your safe production rate. So they're operating at the very maximum and saying that this here is on the maintenance. Now, is that it? I mean, who with common sense would put in a permit? You cannot flare during routine or normal operation. But now you're going to come tell me maintenance because this equipment is on the, you took it out, it's on the maintenance. So you're telling me that what the permit is saying, it's nonsense, because the permit never, that was not the intent of the permit to say that that when you're operating in full production, that's not normal. I mean, anybody with common sense can tell. Now, when they started this mining, the first trick that they tried, they said they come out in the public and they say, hey, things really bad in Guyana. If you recall,
yes, I do.
Oh, it's COVID, Guyana really need this money, they're bad, basically. So we're looking for this balance. Okay, they started out looking for a balance, but now they throw that away, and now they're coming up with something else that says that, we're on the maintenance, which is a it's a major gimmick that we cannot allow to go unnoticed. So, the other thing that they've the other part of the permit that they're not complying with, of course, is for the same flaring again. It had said that you've got to keep spare parts available when this thing started happening. And, it shows that they do not have spare parts available. So now they've got to send it all the way to Germany, etc. Now, any any good operation would, if it happened the first time or the second time, at least the third time, you would say, well, okay, I need to keep spare parts, because there are excuses now where it's not practical for us to keep spare parts for everything. But you know what's your critical piece of equipment. You're flaring, you're destroying the environment. So anybody with any sense would say that that's a pretty critical piece of spare parts that you could be using. Now, here's the other thing. If they want to use this maintenance excuse, they have I guarantee you, they have a maintenance department on that ship. And they're doing maintenance 24/7. They're repairing some pump. There's maintenance going on 24/7 at all times, all around the clock. So are they telling us that throughout 24/7, they should be flaring? So forget about what the permit says. Nothing, absolutely nothing makes sense. And they know it doesn't make sense. But because they feel that they can get away with it, that's what they're attempting to do.
But Dr. Adams, if I can just jump in here, what if someone says, okay, fine, it might not fall under maintenance. Perhaps it can fall under the category of emergencies or process upsets, because ExxonMobil had said it at its press conference that what actually happened, the cause of it, which is axle vibration that resulted in a seal experiencing technical issues, it said that this is not a usual problem. It's something that was very peculiar, very unusual. It's a rare problem for them to experience. So do you think that perhaps they can use that aspect to cover themselves or excuse what's going on?
Absolutely not. And that's what I'm saying.
So what does emergency...
Exactly. The emergency is something just happened and the ship caught on fire, or something, it blows, and the flare, you have a flare because you have gas into the system. And you use the flare to make sure that gas, whatever is held up in the system, it goes through the flare rather than goes out of place, and even could cause additional fire. So emergency is something that just happens suddenly, some blowout of the well or that's an emergency. We know what startup is. And again, we know what maintenance is. Maintenance is not maintaining a piece of equipment. Maintenance is like every 6 months, I think their schedule is to shut down for maintenance. They shut down everything. Now, when you're doing that, of course, when you're shutting down for maintenance, you just don't shut off everything immediately. You still, again, you've got stuff into the system, or you might even want to purge the system or do some work during maintenance where you need to purge the system with some gas, etc. That is maintenance. Maintenance has never anybody with a little common sense. You can't tell me you're in maintenance and you're operating at 120. Operating at 100 at your maximum, it's normal operation. The two, somehow they're trying to, and they know better. So why did they say in the first place when this started happening this last time? Why did they say they're looking for this balance? As to, which is going back to where we were. Remember when we cut back on production to 30,000 barrels? They're looking for this balance. That's what they started saying. But now that's gone through the window. I don't hear them saying anything now about balance anymore. They're up to maximum. So that conversation, so they come up with this new gimmick now with this maintenance stuff, and that was never the intent. I worked for, for over 30 years internationally, and these things are kind of a common understanding that any company with any type of honesty and integrity would not be coming with this kind of nonsense. No wonder their shareholders and investors now are really getting ticked off with their behavior and really pushing pressure on them. So it's a company, that it's really hard to continue to trust what we hear from them. So this here is just absolute dishonesty and nonsense.
Now, Dr. Adams, I want to take you to another comment that came from the ExxonMobil press conference. And I believe that they were responding to a comment that you would have made in one of our reports, which is that ExxonMobil is currently burning 16 million cubic feet of gas per day. That's how much it's burning. Now, you are recommending that if it would slash its production by about 15,000 barrels of oil per day, that would help to reduce flaring. But ExxonMobil is contradicting this. ExxonMobil is saying, well, given the conditions that we have to operate now with the gas compressor being fixed in Germany, reducing it by 15,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 basically doesn't make sense because of the situation that they're in. The only way to bring an end to the flaring or to bring it to pilot levels is basically to stop flaring. It's basically to shut operations down, to stop producing the oil. So how would you respond to that?
All right. Maybe they're doing something there that defies all science or petroleum science. Or they're not reporting what the numbers we're getting is not. And listen up, folks. This has absolutely nothing. Anybody could understand this, okay? There is something called a gas-oil ratio. It means that every barrel of oil that is produced, you also produce 1,000, approximately now, it could be 900, 1,000, but approximately. For every barrel of oil that you produce produce approximately 1,000 cubic feet of gas. Okay? So here comes, if they're producing at 120,000 barrels per day, multiply 120,000 barrels by 1,000, what do you get? 120 million 120 million cubic feet of gas that is produced every day. They're saying that they're flaring 16. So that leaves 104 barrels. 104 million cubic feet. They've got to, by the way, there are three things that they're allowed to do with that gas. So anything outside of those three things, they better explain it. The three things are reinjection, the flaring in those conditions, non-routine flaring, and of course using for energy. So it's energy, reinjection. So here you've got 120 million has to be split up into those three things. It either goes to flaring, it goes to reinjection, or it goes to energy. Now the flaring, they say it's 60 million cubic feet. The energy, I don't know what that number is, but let's assume the last thing that I can remember, let's say it's about 7 million. So that makes 23 million. So you got 97 million cubic feet to take care of. Now, I assume again, they stayed away from explaining this, even though that compressor is, Germany, where are they still injecting? Are there other compressors that they're injecting? Well, I hope they are, because if they're only removing 16, if they're only flaring 16, then if they're not injecting, the question needs to be asked, what's happening with that 97? So let's assume there's a capability to reinject. If you don't have to be a petroleum engineer. If you cut back on producing oil, they can't control that. Like I said before, they can't control how much gas comes up with every barrel of oil. So if you cut back for these numbers now, if you cut back by 15,000 barrels, guess how much gas that's going to have to cut back by? 15,000 multiplied by 1,000 is what? 15 million, right? You subtract 15 million from the 16, guess what you're left with? Pilot flaring. Now,
1 million.
Any common sense, that's common sense. Now, if they're doing something else that has not been explained, because if you notice when they were explaining this thing, they go through all kinds of bamboozling with this train and that train and to confuse people. But that's what they do. First of all, they insult us. If you notice, this here is their new chorus. Oh, it's very complicated. Did you hear how many times?
Yes, they have been saying that it's a technical
it's
and
so
complex matter.
Let me tell you something, and I take those type of things very personal, because I tell you what, and that's what that's how they operate. They intimidate you with that stuff. Oh, it's very complicated. Well, they don't know anything than a lot of us know to start with, because there are lots of Guyanese out there who they can't even come close to what they know. So don't let them come and insult Guyanese, okay? So that's where they come with this intimidation. Oh, it's very technical. Anybody could understand that, okay? A little bit of arithmetic. So let them explain. I think without, you guys should be after them to let them explain. If Is it not correct? Here's the way I put it. Is it not correct that you're producing, is it not correct that the gas oil ratio is 1,000 cubic feet per barrel? Yes, they can't change that. Is it not correct then that if you're producing 120,000 barrels per day, you're going to produce 100 million cubic feet? They can't change that either. Is it not correct that you yourself reporting that you're flaring 16? Okay, well they better say yes, or and then well tell us what's happening with the rest of the gas, and tell us why it doesn't make sense that if you cut back by 15 or whatever, if you cut back for every barrel that you cut back, you can tell us why you're not going to cut back for every barrel that you cut back on. You're not going to also cut back on 15,000 to take care to get it down to flaring. If that's not the case, something else is going on there that
They're
they
not
need to explain.
explaining.
But don't bring this thing about, well, it's technical, and we don't want that. They need to explain it as simple as that.
Thanks, Dr. Adams. Now, do you believe, in light of what you've just said there, that something must be done to give an independent analysis of what ExxonMobil is basically doing out there, and to assess for yourself what's really the cause, and if it really was a manufacturer's issue, or if ExxonMobil had some part to play in this matter?
Well, let me tell you, and they know this because I was very, very unhappy when this thing first, and I even mentioned it on some of your program. And Exxon is attempting to blame this too on the manufacturer.
Yes.
They are responsible for it. When you have equipment such as this, you have people in place. As a matter of fact, you've signed off on the design, and you're supposed to oversee the manufacturing. You're supposed to have a quality assurance, quality control plan to make sure that they're following everything. You can't wait until you bring, this stuff come on site, and then, what's the first thing they said? The wiring. Now, how could a company like tell us that, well, the wiring, it didn't get it right. They didn't wire it completely. So that was the first thing. Then the next thing you hear is the material on the compressor, on the seals. Material is bad. Then the next thing you hear is a valve. Here's the other $1 million question that they've never been able to answer, which is getting back to your question that you were asking. This is not Exxon's first FPSO. They've got FPSOs all over the oceans of the world. Why is it only Guyana where they're having this problem? Why is it only in Guyana where they're ever had this problem on a new ship at that? Okay, so that's getting to your question. Is there something there, that where they're trying to cut costs, etc.? So it's a fair question that they need to answer in terms of an independent review. Trust me, I have thought of it. But then who would be responsible for the independent review? Where the review is going to come from? That's always a ticklish issue to find, because even when I remember when the Department of Energy, they were looking for people for doing independent review. You remember?
Yes.
There was all kinds of questions raised about what independence is. You remember even when the government of Guyana brought in this so-called independence person from Canada to review the
Payara,
field development. When they got rid of me because of my views and the stand that I was taking. So what, let's say you put it in government hands and say, okay, I'm going to have an independent review. That may turn out to be exactly what they're asking for, because guess what? They're going to go there and find somebody that they can call independent. So that's the other issue, a problem that you got when you start asking for an independent review as to how it's going to be structured. Now, I'm not saying you can't have it, but then it has to come down to how it will be structured, who will be in this review, etc. But definitely to get specifically, absolutely, they need an independent review. And I think that's why they believe they can get away with this stuff, is that we do not have the capacity. I have, and you know that I've told you this over and over.
So
I
we're
have
basically
no
being
problem.
taken advantage of.
Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. And they're going to do whatever is best for them, which is making money as much as possible. And they're going to do whatever it is to get away with whatever they can get away with. It's our problem. If we cannot make sure and insist that they do whatever we want them to do in our interest. Remember, we own this oil. We behaving as if they own the oil. We own the oil. We own every single thing that is connected to the oil. The information. I see that even the vice president came out a few weeks ago and said, guess what? I'm going to make sure that all this information is made public. Up to now, we all are still waiting for this information. They're just thumbing their noses at everybody. When I was in the United States, and here's the other thing that really annoys me is that they cannot do these type of things in countries such as the U.S. I worked with the U.S. government for over 30 years at the highest level, and I know I used to manage the Exxons in the world. And when we say jump high, they want to know how high. In Guyana, it's just as if it's the reverse. They're telling us how high they want to jump. So it's a difficult situation, and that is why I cannot afford to. A lot of people ask me why I do it, but I cannot afford to leave things like this, because it would be, they would take even more advantage.
Thanks very much, Dr. Adams. Before we continue, I'd just like to let listeners know who would normally look forward to Petroleum 101, which is hosted by Mr. Kemal King, our other senior journalist. His program would not be on air tonight. He has graciously allowed us to use the time allotted for his show to examine many of the important issues that we have here with Dr. Adams. So just wanted to let our viewers know, those of you who look forward to Petroleum 101, you can definitely catch it next week. So Dr. Adams, just to move forward, now we would have seen a lot of noise about a 14 billion cap that ExxonMobil supposedly had on the flaring. And just to remind some of our listeners, the Vice President, Dr. Bharat Jagdeo, had said at his press conference that, one of his latest press conference, that ExxonMobil has a cap or a limit to which it can flare. And according to the advice that he would have received from the Environmental Protection Agency, that limit would be 14 billion cubic feet of gas. And they would have been reaching that by April. Now, everyone has been trying to understand or figure out where this 14 billion cap came from, because it was never the intention to even allow ExxonMobil, or it was never envisioned for ExxonMobil to be allowed to be flaring for such an extended period of time. The intention is to have all of the gas re-injected. So now we have the situation of where is this 14 billion coming from, because it was not part of the environmental impact assessment that ExxonMobil submitted to the EPA. Now, Dr. Adams, I know that you would have challenged the volume 2 of the EIA, which has many of the various models looking at some of the gases that could be released from flaring, and year on year what some of that might look like. Were you able to look at volume 2?
Well, I looked at the whole document. But again, getting back to what an EIA does. An EIA, it looks at the risk, it looks at scenarios. Or what happens if we do the war. As a matter of fact, it looks at the worst condition. It doesn't mean that you're going to use the worst conditions for operating purposes. A good example is, we ran, well, not we, but in the EIAs, for a spill in the water, oil spill, you ran, I think the scenarios they ran was 5,000 barrels per day being discharged into the water for 30 days. What's going to happen? Then 20,000, they ran both scenarios, 20,000, what's going to happen? For 30 days, of course, you get Trinidad get wiped out. The larger the number is, the worse it is all over the place. So you run those scenarios to see what could happen, but you do not give them the authority to have a spill. You just want to see how to prepare just in case, like an emergency. occur, to prepare for that emergency. It's the same thing with the flare, with that, that table that they're talking about. Well, even Exxon admitted, and even it doesn't even add up. It doesn't even come up to even run the numbers. It's a totally different scenario what they're talking about. They look at, well, okay, if we pump this amount of oil, etc., this is the gas we're going to produce. This is what the gas is made up of. So much CO2. So much CO, hydrogen sulfide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide. And if this thing is flared, this is what's going to happen. But all it does is look at that scenario. It give you no authority whatsoever to say that, okay, this is what you're allowed to do. So that numbers is. But what the EPA does now, and what all the reviews do, they look at it to see if those are credible scenarios. When EPA gets it now, EPA look at it and say, well, okay, it's like a feasibility study that you do on every project, except that this is an environmental feasibility. The EPA looks at it and say, well, okay, here's how I'm going to control this. And in that same document, in terms of flaring, that was not the limiting criteria. In that document, they look at
different scenarios.
That's right. They look at 3 scenarios, or they look at 3 what they call alternatives. And the 3 alternatives were: do you inject the gas and only flare when it's, like I said, in these 3 conditions of emergency, etc. That's one. The second is, do you take the gas, do you export the gas, meaning taking it to shore, etc. And then of course the third was, do you flare everything, right? So you got the one scenario with flaring only during non-routine. The other one is flaring completely at all times. And then the third is exporting. Well, the EIA selected, and this is their EIA, by the way, it's selected the one that we're talking about there, that they're violating, where you only flare, during normal operating conditions. So that's what that's the limiting condition. It had nothing to do with whether it's 14 billion or 100 billion. So that stuff was a made up nonsense. And, and of course, I don't know where they got the number from, but there's no 14 billion number in any part of that EIA. Like I said, it's only these scenarios. So I think when they got caught, they come back and start saying, well, it's a third party. I don't know if it's a separate third party out of the EIA, which means that we really don't care.
No, they had said, Dr. Adams, that the 14 billion is part of the appendices.
Well,
I believe that's volume 2.
All right, here's what I'm going to if they want to prolong this thing to look even worse, please go ask them again to show you where that 14 billion is in that whatever appendix they're talking about. Please ask them to do that.
I certainly will. Dr. Adams, just to move to another aspect of this discussion and the whole 14 billion issue. Exxon is basically saying that nothing in its EIA or the permit sets a limit on the gas that they can flare during these individual circumstances, where you pointed out startup, emergencies or process upsets, and maintenance. Nothing in the EIA or the permit says this is the limit that you can flare for these things.
No, and that is why I'm saying the limit is the condition that I just said. The EIA looked at it. They said you're only going to flare during non-routine conditions, right? Or in emergency or in maintenance. That is the limit, because those things are unusual events. For example, if you just keep on pilot throughout the entire, let's say 365 days a year, multiply 1 million cubic feet per day is the maximum you would ever go on pilot. So even if you go to the maximum, you're looking at 300 to 365 million cubic feet of gas, not even close to a billion, right? This is just flaring. Maintenance is so unusual, it's just a very small part. Then emergency doesn't happen always. So you're looking at the major flaring event is the 300 and let's say 365 million. So the rest of it was always intended. Those are unusual events. So if there was any need to put a limit on it.
Because these unusual events would not
Absolutely.
take you to 13 billion cubic feet of
And
gas
not
that
only
has been
that,
burnt
not
right
only
now.
that, they've got to operate. They got to be. You got to be practical. If you want them to operate out there, those are things you cannot stop. You're gonna have to have maintenance. You're gonna have to have flaring because it's a safety thing. So you have to have flaring, and you got to keep the pilot burning. Okay, so you don't want to put a limit on that, because if you put, let's say we put a limit on 200 million, when you exceed that limit, then you put the operation in an unsafe condition, because now they can't flare. But we're confident, heck, if you do that, there would be, very, very little impact to the environment, because it's so you don't need a limit. So I don't know why, you see, this is so disingenuous on their part, because they're not going to raise in these silly questions. In let's say you're operating in the United States, in the United States, how much time they get when they start up an operation? 48 hours to stop flaring. Okay, that's what I was going after them when I was in the Payara. I heard they give them 60 days.
Yes.
So that's the limit. Those are the limits that you set in those permits. But the thing is, they come here to our country and want to bamboozle us with this intimidation and nonsense, and they can't do these type of things in other countries. No, but
Dr. Adams, just to follow up on that comment there, where you said that in the U.S. they get 48 hours to flare during startup.
Yep.
And Guyana has given them 60 days?
Yes. And even
is that in keeping with international standards?
Well, hey, you know what? Could you, that's my understanding in the Pyro. I was pushing for exactly that. I said you're going to use the United States standard. But my understanding now on the Pyro, and I'm pretty sure that it's 60 days. You remember I left before the permit, but I think that's what it is. Now, let's go with the 60 days. Here's the other thing where they're being disingenuous. When Exxon came in here, and I wasn't there, even though, the ministers are somehow they were blaming me for writing the Liza 1 permit, as you recall, even though I started working for the government a year and 8 months after the permit was written. Mm-hmm. Okay? And as you know, that's what I was going after, to revise those permits, to bring it up to what makes sense. You know that. And one of the big things that I was looking at was when they're playing games with the interpretation of that startup and what it meant. Of course, I didn't get to do all of that because, So so from they came in when I wasn't there, but their records to show. They said from day one we will have no flaring. Day one came, they started complaining. The next thing they know, they asked us, not me alone, because I had the GGMC, I had Department of Energy, Dr. Bino and his people. So we used to meet with them often. They said, well, okay, we need 60 days. Don't worry, we're gonna get it done. We had a big presentation. Said, okay, please get it done in 60 days. 60 days became 90 days. 90 days became 120 days. Then 120 days, of course, became months. So this, in terms of a trust, and all this stuff about so even beyond the 60 days that is currently in the Payara permit, so that is why they're coming back to this maintenance nonsense. It means that if this piece of equipment keeps giving them problem, which is what it has been doing over the past several years, and they expect it's going to continue, this is not going to interfere with their operation. That's why they're coming up with this silliness about maintenance.
Dr. Adams, I'd like to take your attention to another matter, and that has to do with the effect of flaring on the environment. Now, the head of ExxonMobil Guyana, Mr. Alistair Routledge, has said that based on the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment that was done for the Liza Phase 1 project, the studies that would have been done and the findings incorporated into that document clearly note that there would be no significant impact of the flaring that's taking place offshore Guyana. What is your take on this aspect?
You see, here is where their misinformation keeps tripping them up. They're getting hung by, as legal guys would say, hung by their own petard. Because he's absolutely correct. The flaring in accordance with the permit and with the EIA, which says you cannot flare during normal operations. It never gave, we never expected we would have flared 14 billion cubic feet, which is, I think that's the cumulative we've got so far.
No, we've accumulated 13 billion cubic
Or
feet.
13, what if it's
Yes.
13?
Next month, if they continue, then we'll hit that 14 billion mark.
Okay, but my point is, yes, if he's saying that the EIA, when it ran the scenario, it was totally correct to say that if it's based on the permit limits, which is flaring only during,
1 second, Dr. Adams. We're getting some interruptions here. Just bear with us for one moment. Viewers, kindly bear with us for one moment so that we can get the audio correct, because we really want to ensure we get clearly Dr. Adams' comments. All right, we're now going back to our interview. Dr. Adams, can you hear us?
you hear me now?
Yes, very clearly. Kindly continue.
good.
Thank you about that, and we do apologize
right.
for that technical difficulty there.
So, yes. So it is correct to say, and I don't know exactly what they say, it is correct to say, and that's what an EIA does. And EIAs they look at the risk, and remember, they look at 3 scenarios again. They said the 3 reinjection, of course, with flaring only during emergency, etc. Take it to shore or export to, and of course, flaring completely. The EIA did not pick the complete flaring at all times because of this problem. It would have shown in that EIA, that's the reason why it was not selected. That's what an EIA does. It looks at various scenarios and look at it to see which one is safe and environmentally sound. The only safe and environmentally sound option was to re-inject that gas and only flare during those conditions. So let me tell you now, here's what that same EIA says. I'm going to read it for you.
Okay.
Their own statement in the EIA. It says, EEPGL, which is Exxon, proposes to re-inject recovered gas, which is not used as fuel on the FPSO, back into the Liza reservoir. Listen to this part, which represents a significant reduction in potential greenhouse gas emissions versus that which would result from routine flaring. Let me read that again. EEPGL, this is Exxon, okay? EEPGL proposes to re-inject recovered gas, which is not used as fuel in FPSO, back into the Liza reservoir. Why? Which represents a significant reduction in potential greenhouse gas emissions versus that which would result from routine gas flaring. Okay? So if it's significantly reducing greenhouse gas compared to routine, aren't they saying that, aren't they, I mean, so that's the kind of untruth that they get themselves caught up with. So here's another point for you. Export evaluations that I think have been published even in your newspapers or the other newspapers. Export evaluations found that 13 billion cubic feet equivalent that they have flared so far is equivalent to 1.7 million acres of forest. So you tell me, isn't that having an environmental impact? Thirdly, they themselves, during the Payara review, their justification for wanting to flare is, guess is what? They said it's okay to flare because we are a carbon sink, which means that it would not, we've got capacity to absorb more, which means that they're accepting that their, flaring is okay, and the only reason why it's okay because we are a pristine environment So we've got all kinds of capacity to absorb it. Here's the other thing. I don't know where they had their training in terms of what's in flared gas or natural gas, but when last I checked, it has probably over 200 toxins.
Yes, over 200,
Nitrogen
yes.
dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and it creates something called acid rain. Acid rain can, it acid. And if for those of you in the United States and other industrialized areas, you see all the rust. You see sometimes the air when it rains, it's acid that you're getting. It falls into the water. It destroys the water because it becomes acidic, and the life in the water. Your agriculture, it rusts your physical infrastructure, your roof corrosion. So I don't know where they've learned that flaring does not interfere with the environment. But here is the most troubling thing that all Guyanese need to pay attention to. Even in their latest report, Exxon has made the commitment to their investors to reduce. They committed to 40 to 50% decrease in methane intensity. Methane is a big component of the natural gas, okay? And 35 to 45% decrease in flaring across the globe. So you're committing to the rest of the globe. But Little Guyana, guess what? You're a carbon sink. So we could cut back on our global, flaring, which is what they're saying here, by basically almost half. We could cut back on this flaring by almost half. The rest of the globe. But in Guyana, guess what? It's okay. You guys, it's okay because you are a pristine. So you guys need to step up and offer your pristine environment for us to dump stuff here when we're cleaning up other places. That's how I take it. And I think every Guyanese. Now, and on top of that, if you think that I and a lot of us are the only ones, their own shareholders are dissatisfied with their environmental stewardship around the world based on everything that I've been reading. They're even threatening to take over, to have their own board members, etc.
Yes.
So it's not. So this whole environmental thing is not only about me and others among my. It's people right inside of their organization and who heads those organizations that are also troubling. That makes it troubling. They are in Nigeria, in the U.S. They're having the same type of problem where they're regarded as providing misinformation. As a matter of fact, based on the reports, the people have filed lawsuits in Nigeria, in the United States, for what they're calling fraud, for not representing exactly what the facts are. As a matter of fact, I want to read something here.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah?
Sure, go ahead.
These are the kinds of things that that we need. Guyanese can read. If not else, we can read. So just want to put it out there for them to understand it. According to reports coming from other countries, there are many lawsuits in other countries. Nigeria, the USA, for example, alleging fraud in reporting data. And just recently, the slapping of $14.25 million penalty by the U.S. court judge. And I'm going to quote here now in an article that came out here. Exxon, long in an environmentalist crosshairs for trying to cast public doubt on climate science, is accused by New York Attorney General of misleading investors about how climate change will affect its business. This will only be the second climate change case ever to go to trial in the United States. Michael Gerard, director of Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, told CBS. Starting in 2010, Exxon began telling the public that it had assigned a price to carbon internally to model how government regulations would affect its business. However, listen to this here now. It used two figures, a high number that is presented to investors and a lower number in internal documents. Effectively, it was telling investors that its business decisions had fully considered the effects of future government regulations when they did not. Now, here's the part of it. Its dual sets of numbers also had the effect of discouraging investments in clean energy internally because they appeared less profitable when the cost of carbon was low than when it was high. So this is the kind of mistrust. It's not coming from me, but it has been well reported, and so you wonder why they're in these lawsuits, and that is why Guyana has to take note, and we should not be waiting until something has hit us between the eyes, you know. So that's basically what it is. You know, it's a matter of trust.
Okay.
My with all these things that are happening abroad and everybody else, and especially what we're seeing, all of us as Guyanese, we remember our mothers and grandmothers used to say, Hinta Beniba, Mekwashiba take notice. We're getting a lot of signals, and you don't take candlestick to look for thing in the night when you can see it in the broad daylight. So we better take note. We cannot wait. We're lucky that it's only 1 FPSO we've got right now. Imagine Exxon itself, just for the Starbuck block, they're planning on having like 10 FPSOs, my understanding.
Yes, in this decade.
What is going to happen when we start having 20, or maybe because we got a whole lot of other blocks, 20 FPSOs? What the heck is going to be happening out there? So if we do not nip this in the bud here, it could get out of control, and then Guyana would be no use for itself for the future generations.
Thanks, Dr. Adams. We've come down to the final few minutes of the show. And Dr. Adams, I'd ask you to just give your closing remarks on this matter of flaring, and particularly, as someone who would have been brought back from the diaspora to assist Guyana in strengthening its regulatory process, and then you've been removed from that. How do you feel looking back and seeing what your successors are doing, what the current government is doing in terms of responding to this matter? How do you feel about the way the EPA and the government is responding? And your final thoughts on this matter of flaring?
Well, obviously, I'm a little bit disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said before, Exxon is going to do what's in Exxon's best interest. But my disappointment is that when we just swallowing hook, line, and sinker everything that Exxon says, up to, it might have been last week, I think, in the newspapers, it reported that the Honorable Minister, Vikram Bharat, and I like the guy. I mean, he seems, I met him once, and he seems to be a nice guy, so it's nothing personal. But I think he's getting bad advice, most likely. But, he made a comment that I am running wrong as some environmental czar. Those were his exact words. He said that in Parliament. Well, it's not that I want to run around like an environmental czar, but if those who are supposed to be the environmental czar to protect the people in the environment and the health and safety in the country, if they're doing their jobs, I don't have to do this. A lot of members of the diaspora would love to, they want to do exactly what I'm doing. A lot of people on this radio thing here tonight would tell you that I've been doing this way before I took that job with EPA. I came up for decades, every year, 3-4 times a year, doing voluntary work for Guyana. Not only that, I was working very closely with the government in PPP. It didn't matter. As a matter of fact, I had a very close relationship with the past president, Ramutar, Sam Hines, the Prime Minister, and a whole bunch of other Minister Ramsey, because I worked very closely with them. Even during the time when the president was up here, I would go give his vote of thanks for him, President Ramutar, at some of his functions. So this has nothing to do with politics. As a matter of fact, I was just, I would tell him exactly what I feel, what is best for the country. And President Ramutar wanted me to come back home and work for the government even since then. So, because I heard that the vice president had made a statement too that the stuff that I was saying was political, has nothing to do with politics. I agree with him on certain things, as a matter of fact. You remember I was the first one to come out and criticize the past administration for on the contract. The very first one who made the front page of the newspapers, I lost a lot of friends, but it didn't matter. I said, I still believe we should renegotiate that contract because it's not a fair contract to us. Um, we should negotiate, and I agree with the president with gas to shore. Except it should, as long as it's done in an environmentally sound manner. I agree with him also with this thing about producing as much oil as possible. So I have a background. I came from Linden, of course, coming out from which is one of the poorest community, and this country gave me everything that I got, and I will never give up. As long as I can breathe, I will always, try to come back. And a lot of members of the diaspora like myself, because I know they used to support me in my endeavors. I remember I came from that community, one of the poorest community in the whole country. I played cricket for Guyana. I remember wearing the colors of Guyana as a teenager, representing your country at cricket. I mean, so that flag is just get stuck in my heart, and I would never give that up. So I will not sit by. And I remember even when I was a little kid, when Guyana became independent, sat there at the Christian Moore Community Center and saw them raise the flag. Just a little kid, saw them raise the flag, and that has stuck with me also. People like Barnum and Jagan fought hard for this country, for independence, and I will not sit by and see this country become recolonized by the likes of Exxon.
Do you think that's what's happening?
Well, recolonization mean a lot to a whole lot of people, but to me, when Exxon appears to be, to be above the law, because that's basically what's happening here. They're not following the law. They're thumbing their noses at the law, and the government is not coming after them for it. To me, that appears to be, I'm not a social, political science major or anything, but to me, that's what it borders on. That it's a just if we're being recolonized by Exxon, and that the people the people have got to stand up and hold the government accountable, and stop that. Stop Exxon. Exxon cannot do that to the United States, and that's what really bothers me. So they're basically taking advantage of country that are at a disadvantage without the resources, etc. So that's where I stand.
Okay, Doctor.
And remember now, Exxon, just to end on this note, Exxon, and the thing is, it's frustrating when we allow Exxon to believe they've got this hold over us. Exxon cannot survive. In my opinion, there's no way Exxon could survive without Guyana. Exxon need us far more than we need them. They're in some serious, from the reports that you and everybody else have been getting, they're in some serious financial trouble. And maybe that's the reason why they do not want to cut back on production, even though it's at the expense of our health and safety and the environment. This last declared discovery here that took us to 18 billion barrels. Do you know what that did to Exxon? That means, and more, there's more to come, because this is only from this numbers from the starboard block. You know what this means? That we are now accounting for, when I run the numbers, for at least 25% of all of Exxon's oil recoverable reserves throughout the world. Exxon is paying attention, you read it all the time, to two fields, two projects, Guyana and the Permian Basin in West Texas. It so happened that guess where the two places I worked? Guyana and the Permian Basin. That's where I spent my 6 years with Exxon, not Exxon, with British Petroleum as a senior reservoir engineer and production. It was in the Permian Basin. So it's just a coincidence there. So they need us, and when I hear the impasse of when the new president of Exxon came into Guyana, the first words he uttered, well, if we don't like it, they're gonna get out of here.
Yes, remember? They can take their investments elsewhere.
Take their business ahead. I would have told him if I would say, hey, buddy, it's your choice. You go. I bet you would have you see the competitors would be tripping over each other to get into Guyana with a much better deal. So all of that is just big talk with nothing behind it and a whole bunch of bluff. They cannot do without Guyana. Period.
And it appears as though we're behaving like it's the other way around.
Absolutely, and that was my whole point there, because it just they own everything and we are treating them. We have got to understand that we are in charge of our oil, we are in charge of all the information. We should be telling them we're the ones that have the leverage, telling, hey, what, this is, because that's how it happens in other countries. That's how it happens in other countries. So don't come to me with this BS where it's too technical, you guys wouldn't understand. And guess what? We have to produce. It doesn't matter how we're disrupting the environment. We have to produce, because think bad. You all been under COVID. You need the money to survive. It's nonsense. They need it. They need it more than we do. And I know, because I used to sign these guys, or what companies get for fees and stuff. And let me tell you something. You see all these managers and stuff. The way that they get their promotions and raises and bonuses is to meet their targets. The persons who are sitting up in there in Washington, the only thing that or wherever their head office, they're looking at is, okay, did you meet your target of 10 million, whatever the number is, 10 million barrels? So that, I know that's what's driving them towards producing at all costs. You think that when they're trying to meet those targets, they're really caring about our. Here's another thing, you're talking about permits. Here's another thing. Do you know that a company such as Exxon, they do not even follow their own procedures? In that same permit, the same Liza 1 permit, it says clearly, you have to comply with all manufacturer specifications. Guess what? We had six times where they failed to maintain. And it's about maintenance, by the way, where the holes, they did not inspect it, which was part of their own procedures, and it's in the permit that says you've got to, when you buy something, it says, you got to do certain things. In our permit, it says you got to follow manufacturer's specifications. They did it. We gave them a pass for the first 3. Guess what? They still go ahead. 6 in a year, they go ahead. Well, so when you remember when we decided to fine them, they refused to pay it. And then we decided to take them to court. Well, of course, when I left, my understanding is that they pushed that aside. But that's a safety problem. And I can tell you, I ran safety programs in the United States. And I go back to the Piper Alpha accident in the North Sea several years ago. It killed 169 workers. The rig caught on fire. You know what it was? Just a simple thing of not following procedure. So if you're gonna get away, you may get away with it with these small things. But if that's your mindset, you're not following procedure. Trust me, it's a dangerous situation. But again, they believe that they're bigger than the law. We decided to fine them. They said, "Oh, we're not paying the fine." So I said, "Okay, watch me. Take you to court." But guess what? It's that's another question. Ask them what happened to that case.
It was actually filed in court?
No. I think it was. I think we were just at the point of filing it. But we had all the stuff written up and everything ready to go. So I would appreciate if you asked what's the status.
Well, we have found out about the status of that matter. They're no longer pursuing it.
Well, you see, if you don't hold them accountable, then. And which is a whole lot of other things, like the water dumping, for example, that I was standing up for. So there's a whole lot of things that we are allowing them to get away. The water dumping, for example, then they go again and misrepresenting information by saying that the World Bank allows it. Heck, the World Bank never said that. The World Bank says dumping water has to be your very last resort. You have to re-inject that water, which is common. You have to re-inject. And they said, what the World Bank said, it's only if it's not feasible, not technically feasible, nor financially feasible. No, Don't tell me. And then when you ask him, well, okay, what is it going to cost? Is it $300 million? You're telling me that the lives of Guyanese are not worth $300 million when you're going to be working, making tens of billions of dollars? You know, that's what I'm saying. It just points to this thing as if Guyanese lives and health and safety in the environment really doesn't matter as long as they, I mean, that's what, there's no other way for me at least to interpret it. And I think that's the way all Guyanese should be taking notice, not only what's happening here in Liza 1, but what's happening to the rest of the, what's going on in the rest of the world with these lawsuits.
Okay. Dr. Adams, I want to thank you very much again for joining us on tonight's episode of Governance, Corruption, and Justice. You have definitely given us a lot of food for thought, and I know that we can depend on you being back on the program to share your knowledge with us. So once again, sir, thank you very much for participating in this discussion tonight. And to our listeners, wherever you might be, we thank you again for being part of our weekly discussions on oil and gas. It's a very important sector. It's going to dominate the economy for quite some time, and it's important that we understand every aspect of this sector. With that being said, I'd like to say good night, everyone, and do continue to stay safe. Good night, Dr. Adams.
All right, thanks, Kiana.